The air over the Mojave Desert on August 14, 2018, was a shimmering, suffocating blanket of heat. In this forgotten corner of San Bernardino County, California, the silence was a physical presence, broken only by the incessant buzz of insects and the distant, approaching wail of a lone sheriff's patrol car. The overwhelming scent of sun-scorched creosote bush and dry dust clung to everything, a permanent feature of a landscape that seemed hostile to life itself. As the siren grew louder, it echoed a desperate urgency against the vast, indifferent emptiness. The camera pans across a desolate clearing, revealing a cluster of dilapidated structures, weather-beaten trailers and ramshackle huts pieced together from rusted scrap metal and splintered wood, their forms nearly dissolving into the beige and brown panorama of the desert. This was a place off the map, a community existing in a time of its own making, far from the reach of the modern world. Deputy Frank Miller, a 54-year-old veteran of the sheriff's department with weariness etched into the lines around his eyes, stepped out of his vehicle, the blast of heat hitting him like a physical blow. He was just a few years from retirement and thought he'd seen everything the county's desolate stretches had to offer, but the dispatch call had been unnerving. A utility worker, checking a remote power line, had reported seeing a small child with a horrific injury, wandering alone. Miller's gaze swept the compound before landing on a small, wiry boy, no older than 10, sitting in the dirt. The boy was intently prodding a dead scorpion with a long stick, completely absorbed. As Miller drew closer, his stomach tightened. The boy's left arm hung at a sickeningly unnatural angle. A shard of bone, stark white and razor-sharp, protruded gruesomely from the skin of his forearm. A severe compound fracture that should have had the child screaming in agony. Miller fought to keep his expression neutral, his training kicking in to mask the shock and horror rising in his throat. He knelt slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the boy. The child, whose name he would later learn was Caleb, finally looked up from the dead scorpion. His eyes were strikingly clear, wide with a calm curiosity that was profoundly disturbing. There were no tears streaking his dusty cheeks, no grimace of pain, no sign of distress whatsoever. He simply stared at the uniformed officer with a placid, almost vacant expression. Miller softened his voice, trying to project a gentleness that belied the alarm bells ringing in his head. "Son, my God," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Does that hurt?" Caleb just looked at him, a faint, unnerving smile touching his lips as he gave a single, slow shake of his head. The simple gesture was more terrifying than any scream could ever have been. The deputy's radio crackled to life, the burst of static a jarring intrusion into the unnatural quiet. Miller, still on one knee, never took his eyes off Caleb. He slowly rose, taking a deliberate step back before keying his microphone, his voice a low, urgent murmur that carried across the parched ground. "Dispatch, this is 7 Adam 15. I'm on scene at the coordinates provided. I have a visual on the child. We're going to need medical aid, code 3. The reporting party was not exaggerating. I'm looking at a juvenile male, approximately 10 years of age, with a severe compound fracture to the left forearm. Bone is exposed." He paused, taking a breath, choosing his next words carefully. "Be advised, the child he's conscious, alert, and appears to be in no discernible pain. I repeat, no discernible pain. The situation here is unusual. Notify CPS, have a supervisor meet me at this location." The silence that followed his transmission felt heavier than before, charged with a new, official gravity. Within 15 minutes, the desert silence was shattered again, this time by the crunch of tires on gravel and the rumble of a diesel engine. An ambulance from the San Bernardino County Fire Department pulled into the clearing, followed closely by another sheriff's cruiser. As two paramedics, a man and a woman, jumped out with their medical bags, figures began to emerge from the doorways of the dilapidated trailers. They moved without haste, their gaits slow and deliberate, their faces weathered and unreadable. An older man, tall and gaunt with piercing eyes and a long, graying beard, stepped forward, positioning himself between the officers and the boy. He held no weapon, yet his presence was a clear and formidable barrier. The other family members, men, women, and a few other children, fanned out behind him, forming a silent, watchful semicircle. They didn't speak or gesture, but their collective stare was a wall of passive, unnerving resistance. The younger male paramedic, Mark, approached with a practiced, non-threatening posture, his hands held up gently. "Sir, we're here to help the boy. We need to take a look at his arm." The old man's gaze, sharp as flint, didn't waver. "He don't need your help," he rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "It's a trial. The Lord's will. We tend to our own." Behind him, a woman in a faded calico dress, Caleb's mother, Sarah, clutched her hands together, her knuckles white. Her eyes darted from the patriarch to her son, then to the uniformed officers. A flicker of raw fear and conflict passed over her face before being quickly suppressed, replaced by the same mask of stoic resignation worn by the others. She was a prisoner of a belief system that was now being challenged by flashing lights and the undeniable authority of the state. Deputy Miller stepped forward, placing himself between the paramedic and the patriarch, Jebediah. His tone was no longer gentle, it was firm, the voice of law in a lawless place. "Sir, I understand you have your ways out here, but right now, that boy is the victim of what the state of California considers felony child endangerment. That bone needs to be set by a doctor, and he needs antibiotics before that wound gets infected. This is no longer a request." He gestured to the paramedics. "They are going to stabilize him, and then he's being transported to a hospital. You can either cooperate, or I can place you under arrest for obstruction and interference with a medical aid call. The choice is yours, but that boy is leaving with us." The old man's jaw tightened, his eyes burning with a cold fire, but he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The standoff was over, for now, but the real battle had just begun. The moment Caleb was secured in the ambulance, the desert clearing transformed from a tense standoff into a nascent crime scene. Deputy Miller's initial report, logged under incident number 18-2457, was a concise but chilling account that quickly rippled up the chain of command at the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department. The phrase, "no discernible pain," acted as a catalyst, elevating the case from a standard child welfare check to something far more perplexing. Within hours, a multi-agency task force was being quietly assembled. Child Protective Services formalized their investigation, filing an emergency petition with the court, while Miller's superiors began coordinating with the California Department of Justice. The state had a compelling interest not only in the welfare of one child but in understanding the full scope of what was happening within the isolated Whitaker clan. The initial report was flagged, its unusual details triggering protocols for potential cult activity and extreme medical neglect, setting in motion a meticulous and far-reaching inquiry. At UCLA Medical Center, Dr. Alicia Singh moved with a calm, focused intensity that belied the astonishing nature of Caleb's case. The boy's initial X-rays were a roadmap of past trauma, revealing a history of multiple, poorly healed fractures in his ribs, clavicle, and legs, injuries he had apparently endured without complaint. This clinical evidence screamed congenital insensitivity to pain, or CIP. Dr. Singh drew blood for genetic sequencing, but her investigation extended beyond the lab. She cross-referenced Caleb's preliminary information with the National Organization for Rare Disorders, NORD, database and other genetic repositories. The search came up empty. There were no known clusters of CIP in Southern California, making the Whitakers a potential genetic anomaly of profound scientific interest. She understood immediately that this wasn't just about one boy, it was about an entire family trapped in a biological reality that made them uniquely vulnerable, a vulnerability dangerously misinterpreted as a spiritual trial. Back in San Bernardino, Deputy Miller found himself trading his patrol car for a desk piled high with archival boxes. His part of the investigation became a deep dive into the county's memory, a search for the Whitaker family's ghost-like footprint. He spent days scrolling through microfilmed property records at the Hall of Records, his eyes straining against the flickering text. He finally found it. A land deed from 1934, purchased by an Abelard Whitaker for a remote, undesirable tract of desert land. Following that lead, he unearthed a handful of birth certificates from the 1940s and early 50s, but then the trail went cold. No official births, no deaths, no marriage licenses, no tax records. It was as if the family had consciously decided to sever all ties with the outside world, systematically erasing their own existence from the official narrative of the state, becoming a living piece of folklore. The case's strange details eventually triggered an alert at the federal level. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico, Virginia, was briefed on the situation. While not yet an active federal case, the potential for a heavily armed, anti-government sovereign citizen-type group or a coercive cult was too significant to ignore. An analyst created a preliminary profile of Jebediah Whittaker based on Miller's report, classifying him as a charismatic authoritarian leader exhibiting extreme isolationist and paranoid tendencies. They ran the known family names through the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, and other federal databases, but the results were eerily clean. The Whittakers had no criminal history, no credit scores, no digital footprint whatsoever. To the modern surveillance state, they were invisible, a fact that agents found more disturbing than a long rap sheet. This level of total isolation was a hallmark of groups with something profound to hide. Armed with a growing mountain of evidence, the task force moved to secure a comprehensive search and inspection warrant for the entire Whittaker compound. The legal justification was ironclad, a three-pronged argument presented to a San Bernardino County Superior Court judge. First, there was Deputy Miller's sworn testimony detailing felony child endangerment. Second, there was Dr. Singh's preliminary medical report, which provided a scientific basis for suspecting that all children on the property were at extreme risk due to undiagnosed CIP. Finally, there was the historical evidence of the family's complete withdrawal from society, suggesting a deliberate and ongoing effort to conceal their children from state and medical authorities. The warrant was granted, authorizing law enforcement and CPS to enter the property, assess the living conditions, and conduct welfare checks on every individual present, setting the stage for a second, more intrusive confrontation with the silent, watchful clan. The morning of August 16th was supposed to be the day the state moved in. A convoy of sheriff's vehicles and CPS vans was staged at a dusty turnout miles from the Whittaker compound, the team leaders going over the final entry plan. But just as the sun crested the mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor, a call came through from the county council's office. The warrant had been challenged. A lawyer from a small, Bakersfield-based civil liberties group had filed an emergency motion on behalf of the Whittaker family, arguing that the warrant was an unconstitutional intrusion based on insufficient evidence. The motion cited religious freedom and the right to family privacy, framing Caleb's injury as an isolated accident that was being used as a pretext to persecute a reclusive, nonconformist religious group. A superior court judge, wary of the explosive optics, granted a temporary stay, scheduling a hearing for the following week. The convoy stood down. The momentum was shattered, replaced by the grinding, frustrating gears of the legal system. The Whittakers' invisible wall had just been reinforced with brick and mortar. The legal delay immediately exposed the fault lines within the multi-agency task force. Deputy Miller, whose visceral memory of Caleb's exposed bone fueled his sense of urgency, was incensed. He argued vehemently in meetings that the children were in imminent danger, that every hour wasted in a courtroom was an hour one of them could be dying from an infection or an internal injury they couldn't even feel. His pleas, however, ran headlong into the cautious pragmatism of Child Protective Services. The CPS regional director, a career administrator named Diane Lipton, was acutely aware of the potential for a public relations nightmare. Her department was already stretched thin, and she had no appetite for a protracted legal battle that could paint her agency as government aggressors trampling on the rights of a devout family. She advocated for a slower, more methodical approach. Wait for Dr. Singh's full genetic workup on Caleb, build an unassailable case, and let the legal process play out. The standoff wasn't just in the desert anymore, it was now in a sterile conference room in San Bernardino. While the government agencies argued, Jebediah Whittaker used the time to his advantage, not by disappearing, but by digging in. The state's initial intervention had been a gift, a perfect validation of his decades-long sermon about the corrupt and predatory nature of the outside world. He gathered his family, his voice ringing with the conviction of a prophet whose direst warnings had come to pass. He told them the authorities had stolen Caleb not to heal him, but to defile him, to break him, to turn him against his own blood. The story of their persecution began to seep into the sparse, interconnected communities of the high desert, passed along by the few truckers and prospectors who occasionally interacted with the clan. The narrative was simple and effective. A humble, self-sufficient family was being targeted by the government for living differently. Without ever using a phone or a computer, Jebediah had launched a counter-offensive, building a bulwark of local suspicion that would make the state's next move even more difficult. In her lab at UCLA, Dr. Alicia Singh stared at a string of code on her computer monitor, the culmination of days of rapid genetic sequencing. The results were both a confirmation and a revelation. Caleb Whitaker's DNA showed a clear mutation on the SCN9A gene, a well-known cause of congenital insensitivity to pain. But this wasn't a documented variant. It was something new, a unique signature that appeared to have originated and then concentrated within this single, isolated bloodline. The specific mutation affected the NaV1.7 sodium channels in pain-sensing nerves, essentially silencing them completely. This wasn't just a medical diagnosis, it was a genetic Rosetta Stone. Dr. Singh realized the Whitaker family represented a one-of-a-kind opportunity to study the pathways of pain and human evolution, but that scientific curiosity was eclipsed by a chilling thought. This single genetic quirk was likely responsible for a hidden history of unmourned suffering and premature death. Frustrated by the legal impasse and the bureaucratic inertia, Deputy Miller decided to sidestep the official channels. He drove his personal truck out to a dusty, one-room museum in a nearly forgotten town on the edge of the county, a place that smelled of old paper and wood polish. The curator was an elderly woman named Martha, whose family had lived in the area for 5 generations. Miller showed her an old, grainy photograph of the original Whitaker homestead he'd found in the archives. Martha's eyes lit up with recognition. She didn't speak of them as a religious cult, but as a local legend, the Stone People, she called them. She recounted stories her grandfather used to tell about the Whitaker men, who could handle barbed wire with bare hands or walk on broken glass without flinching. For decades, it had been dismissed as tall tales, the kind of folklore that springs from the isolation of the desert. For Miller, it was the first proof that the family's condition wasn't a recent development, but a generational curse. Back in the sterile environment of the San Bernardino crime lab, a digital forensics analyst was meticulously enhancing the high-resolution photographs taken during Deputy Miller's first visit to the compound. He was looking for anything out of place, any detail that might strengthen the case for neglect. As he adjusted the contrast on an aerial shot of the property's northern edge, his focus sharpened. There, tucked behind a cluster of gnarled Joshua trees, were several small, evenly spaced depressions in the ground. They were subtle, almost lost in the desert scrub, but their pattern was unmistakable. Each was marked with a single, flat river stone, devoid of any inscription. They weren't random dips in the terrain, they were graves. The analyst immediately flagged the images and sent an urgent notification to the task force leaders. The case had just taken a dark and profound turn. The question was no longer just about the children who were alive, but about how many had been buried in silence. The discovery of the suspected graves shattered the internal debate within the task force. Diane Lipton's cautious, politically sensitive approach was instantly rendered obsolete. The potential for multiple, concealed deaths from untreated medical conditions provided the irrefutable evidence of imminent risk she had been waiting for. The San Bernardino County District Attorney's Office was immediately looped in, and the tone of the investigation shifted from welfare to homicide. The legal team now had a powerful new weapon. They could argue that the family's religious freedom and right to privacy had created a killing field, where children and adults alike succumbed to preventable ailments like appendicitis, peritonitis, or sepsis from untended wounds, their deaths hidden from the world. Jebediah Whitaker was no longer just a stubborn patriarch practicing a fringe belief. He was the potential overseer of a multi-generational tragedy, and the state now had a solemn duty to unearth the truth, no matter how grim. Armed with Dr. Singh's definitive genetic report and the chilling photographic evidence of a secret family cemetery, the county's legal team filed an emergency motion to lift the temporary stay on their search warrant. They didn't stop there. They simultaneously petitioned for a second, far more comprehensive warrant, one that would authorize a full forensic excavation of the suspected burial sites by the coroner's office. The civil liberties lawyer representing the Whitakers was caught completely off guard, his arguments about religious persecution now ringing hollow against the stark evidence of a deadly genetic disorder and a potential graveyard. The hearing was swift. The judge, faced with the specter of dead children and a scientific certainty of extreme medical vulnerability, immediately granted both requests. The invisible wall Jebediah had built around his family was about to be torn down, not with a battering ram, but with the unassailable weight of science and the undeniable authority of the law. The dawn of August 22nd broke with the rumble of engines, a sound the desert had not heard on this scale since the army trained here for World War II. A convoy of Sheriff's Department SUVs, Child Protective Services vans, and a mobile command unit from the coroner's office kicked up a plume of dust as it snaked its way toward the isolated Whitaker compound. This was no longer a welfare check, it was a full-scale raid, executed with methodical precision. Deputies in tactical vests established a secure perimeter while CPS workers, trained in trauma-informed care, moved in to engage the family members. Jebediah stood on the porch of his trailer, his face a mask of cold fury, but this time his silent authority was meaningless against the sheer, overwhelming force of the state. His family, scattered and separated for individual interviews, looked on with a mixture of fear and resignation as the officials began their grim, court-ordered work. The invisible fortress had been breached. While most of the Klan met the questions of social workers and deputies with a wall of practiced silence, a single crack appeared in the family's facade. Sarah Whitaker, Caleb's mother, was led to a quiet corner by a veteran CPS supervisor, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle voice. The combination of seeing her son safe, hearing the scientific explanation of their condition, and now facing the stark reality of the state's intervention, finally broke her. The stoicism she had worn like armor for decades crumbled. Her confession started as a whisper, a torrent of fear and guilt. She confirmed the existence of the graves, but then added a piece of information that made the supervisor's blood run cold. Just 2 nights prior, Jebediah's own brother, Josiah, had died. He had complained of a strange fullness in his stomach, then simply laid down and never woke up. Jebediah had declared it God's will and buried him before sunrise. Sarah's testimony was the critical piece of the puzzle the task force had been missing. It transformed the investigation from a case of historical neglect into one of immediate, active endangerment and potential criminal negligence. The coroner's team, guided by Sarah's furtive glance toward a patch of freshly disturbed earth, immediately prioritized that specific site. The exhumation was a somber, meticulous affair conducted under the harsh desert sun. When they uncovered Josiah's body, the preliminary findings were immediate and damning. The autopsy would later confirm the cause of death was a ruptured appendix, leading to peritonitis and septic shock, a condition that would have caused excruciating, unmistakable pain in anyone else. Here was the tragic, tangible proof of the family's curse. This wasn't a spiritual trial, it was a fatal and preventable medical event. Jebediah's rigid ideology had just cost his own brother his life, and the state now had the evidence to prove it. The news of Josiah's death, coupled with the coroner's grim work, was too explosive to contain. Someone within the task force, likely a lower-level employee horrified by the details, leaked the information to a local television news reporter. Within 12 hours, the story of the Whitaker clan went from a strange local curiosity to a national media firestorm. Satellite trucks from Los Angeles and even national networks descended on the remote dirt road leading to the compound, their antennas forming a strange, metallic forest against the desert sky. The narrative was immediately sensationalized with lurid headlines: "The Painless People of the Mojave, House of Horrors," and "California's Cursed Cult." The intense media scrutiny put immense, unbearable pressure on every agency involved. The San Bernardino District Attorney's Office, now operating under a microscope, accelerated its timeline for filing charges, while Diane Lipton and CPS found their every move questioned and criticized by a public hungry for swift, decisive action. The public's reaction was a maelstrom of outrage and morbid fascination, a digital wildfire that mirrored the sensationalism of the news coverage. Social media platforms erupted with hashtags like #JusticeForCaleb and #WhitakerCult, with millions of people weighing in, demanding Jebediah's arrest and decrying the decades of apparent institutional failure that allowed the family to exist in such a state. This wave of public anger, however, was met by a smaller, yet fiercely vocal, counter-current. Fringe groups, encompassing anti-government sovereign citizens and fundamentalist religious advocates, latched onto the story as a prime example of state overreach. They descended on the perimeter of the compound, their protest signs proclaiming, "Family privacy is a right," and "Stop persecuting faith." The scene outside the police cordon devolved into a tense, surreal circus, a physical manifestation of the country's deepest ideological schisms, played out on the dusty doorstep of a family that had tried to escape the world entirely. As the forensic teams meticulously worked the grave sites under the glare of both the desert sun and the media spotlight, a new, more ancient threat began to gather on the horizon. The notorious Santa Ana winds started to howl through the canyons, hot, dry, and relentless. Miles to the east, a downed power line sparked in the brittle brush. The fire started small, a single plume of smoke against the vast blue sky, but fueled by the ferocious winds and the tinder-dry landscape, it exploded into a raging inferno. The fire front, a wall of orange and black, began to sweep westward with terrifying speed, directly on a path towards the Whitaker compound. The complex, multi-agency operation instantly shifted from a methodical investigation to a desperate, life-or-death scramble. The urgent cry of "wildfire" over the police radios transformed the crime scene into an evacuation zone, forcing a frantic retreat from an indifferent enemy that threatened to incinerate every shred of evidence. The evacuation was a scene of controlled chaos, a frantic race against the approaching flames and the suffocating smoke. Deputies and CPS workers, their faces covered with masks, moved with urgent purpose, pulling the stunned and resistant Whitaker family members from their interviews and herding them toward a convoy of waiting vans. In the swirling confusion of ash and embers, Sarah's youngest child, a 5-year-old girl named Leah, tripped and fell hard near a rusted pile of abandoned farming equipment. She scrambled back to her feet almost instantly, her face streaked with soot but showing no sign of injury or distress. Sarah, her focus split between keeping her children together and obeying the deputy's commands, scooped the girl into her arms and rushed her into the back of a van. The convoy peeled out, tires spinning in the deep dust, just as the first wave of fire crested the nearby ridge, the roar of the flames drowning out all other sounds. They had escaped the inferno, but in the chaos, a new and deadly threat had just been silently planted within the family. The temporary shelter was a high school gymnasium, a cavern of echoing noise and fluorescent lights that smelled of stale sweat, plastic sheeting, and the lingering scent of smoke. The Whitaker clan huddled together on a set of bleachers, a silent, bewildered island in a sea of anxious evacuees. Sarah held her daughter Leah on her lap, rocking her gently. But the girl wasn't restless, she was limp. A strange heat radiated from her small body, and her skin felt clammy to the touch. Sarah's eyes traced the faint, bluish tint around her daughter's lips. She remembered Josiah's final hours, the quiet complaint of a full belly, the lethargy, the stillness. She thought of the fall, of the jagged pile of rusted metal Leah had stumbled into. A cold, terrifying certainty washed over her, a clarity that cut through a lifetime of indoctrination. This wasn't God's trial, it was poison, spreading through her daughter's body from a wound she couldn't feel. The same poison that had killed Josiah. With a surge of adrenaline that banished all fear, Sarah stood up, pulling the feverish Leah tight against her chest. Jebediah's head snapped towards her, his eyes cold and sharp. "Sit down, woman," he commanded, his voice a low growl meant only for her. "The Lord is testing us. We will pray for her fever to break. Do not bring the shame of the outside world upon us now." For the first time in her life, Sarah did not flinch. She met his gaze, her own eyes burning with a righteous fury he had never seen. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady, loud enough for the family members nearby to hear. "She fell. She's hurt, just like Josiah was." She took a step towards the gymnasium doors. "You let him die. You called it God's will. You will not have her." She pushed past her stunned brother-in-law, her every step a definitive act of rebellion, leaving Jebediah and the doctrine that had defined their lives shattered in her wake. Sarah burst through the double doors into the cool night air, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She scanned the chaotic parking lot, a dizzying array of flashing emergency lights, and spotted Deputy Miller coordinating with a fire captain near an ambulance. "Help!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "Please, help my daughter." Miller turned, his expression shifting from weary focus to immediate alarm as he saw the child in her arms. He rushed over, his training instantly taking over. He saw the girl's shallow breathing, her pallor, the sheen of feverish sweat. "Paramedics, over here, now," he yelled, his voice cutting through the noise. As 2 EMTs sprinted towards them with a gurney, Sarah finally allowed herself to collapse into a wave of shuddering relief. In the gymnasium doorway, Jebediah stood frozen, a statue of obsolete authority, watching the machinery of the modern world he so despised move with swift, life-saving purpose to save the child he had been willing to sacrifice. His power was broken. In the aftermath, the legal system delivered its verdict not with a gavel's crash, but with the quiet hum of judicial pragmatism. Jebediah Whitaker, facing a litany of charges from felony child endangerment to criminal negligence contributing to the death of his brother, was ultimately spared a prison sentence. The San Bernardino County District Attorney's Office, facing the prospect of a protracted and bizarre trial that would further traumatize the children, offered a plea deal. Jebediah pleaded no contest to a lesser charge of endangerment. His sentence was 5 years of stringent probation and, more devastatingly for him, a permanent court order stripping him of any and all guardianship over the minor children of his clan. For a man whose entire identity was built on absolute authority, it was a punishment more profound than any prison cell. He was left a king with no kingdom, a prophet with no followers, an old man left to fade into the desert that had so long been his fortress. The Whitaker family, once a monolithic unit bound by blood and belief, fractured into a diaspora of survivors. The children, including Caleb and a fully recovered Leah, were placed in the care of the state, entering a new world of specialized foster homes. Their education became a curriculum of self-preservation. Daily visual checks for cuts and bruises, learning to recognize the external signs of a fever or infection, and understanding that their lack of pain was a vulnerability, not a virtue. Sarah, estranged from the hardline loyalists who clung to Jebediah's teachings, became a fierce advocate for her children, working with social services to ensure they received the care they needed. The fire that had consumed their compound became a cleansing inferno, erasing the physical structures of their past and forcing the younger generation onto a new, uncertain path toward a life their ancestors had deliberately fled. The true legacy of the Whitaker family is a chilling American parable about the profound danger of isolation. Their story is not ultimately about a genetic curse, but about the man-made prison of ignorance and fear that was built around it. The unique SCN9A mutation that ran through their bloodline is now studied in labs like Dr. Singh's, offering invaluable data in the quest for new pain therapies and a deeper understanding of human neurology. The unrecorded suffering of the Whitakers, buried for generations under desert stones, has inadvertently contributed to a future where others might suffer less. It's a stark reminder that belief, when severed from reason and compassion, can become a more destructive force than any biological anomaly, leaving a scar not on the body, but on the soul of a family, for generations to come. If this case left you with more questions than answers, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the stories that exist in the forgotten corners of our world. We have another investigation ready for you. A case about a family that vanished from a crowded national park, leaving behind a single, cryptic clue. Click here to watch it now. You won't believe where the trail leads.